Wade Wilson. By now, that's a name you recognize. And if you don't, it's surely a face you recognize.
Unfortunately, in the way that he presents himself, he reminds you of almost a cartoon villain, but his actions were definitely no joke.
Wilson is one of the most memorable defendants in recent history, not just from his appearance, but the extreme severity of his crimes, which, by the way, he was convicted of at the start of the summer. Here's the jury's recommendation for a punishment.
We, the jury, find by a vote of 10-2 that Wade Wilson should be sentenced to death.
But now, his defense is saying there's some evidence that Wilson has traumatic brain injury.
He's got a diseased mind. We can't relate to that. It's hard for us to know what's going through his head.
So doctors are going to check this all out and see if Wilson really does have brain injuries. That's right, he's actually being transported from the Lee County Jail in Florida, likely in shackles, to a medical facility for tests. And the clock is ticking. He's set to be sentenced next Tuesday. That's where the case's judge will make the major decision to either uphold the death penalty recommendation or sentence Wilson to life in prison. So how did we get here? Let's let prosecutors explain.
The defendant went there to have a good time, and he discarded the woman he came with, and he chose one that caught his eye, Christine Melton. And as he told detectives, this is what I do with women, you know. I use my charm, I use my good looks. That's what I did with the first girl, and that's how I got in her head. And look what happened to her. When the defendant first approaches Christine, he's not threatening. He's smooth, he's charming. He's nice to her and her friend Stephanie. They party together, no red flags, no sign of aggression. He's a fun guy, but he waits. He waits until he's back at her house, in her bed, and Stephanie has gone home. He waits until he is alone with her, until there are no other witnesses. He waits until she is asleep, defenseless. The defendant says she can't get away from him, even if she wanted to, because he's too strong. And when she can't get away is when he kills her, when he strangles her, because he was the lion and she was the prey.
Wilson met 35-year-old Christine Melton at a bar with live music in Fort Myers, Florida. It was October 6th, 2019. And then, as prosecutors described, he strangled her to death after she took him back to her Cape Coral home. Here's what Wilson's biological father testified to at his trial.
He said he met a girl at a bar. They went back to her house, hung out for a little bit, and then she fell asleep.
What did he say happened after she fell asleep?
He said he got on top of her and choked her.
What name did he call her? Did he refer to her in a derogatory term?
He said, I choked that.
What did he say he did after he choked her?
He said he stayed in the house for a little while, and then he rolled her up and was going to try to put her in her trunk, but he couldn't lift her.
Did he say why he was unable to put her in her trunk?
He said that he felt like rigor mortis had started to set in.
And does rigor mortis make your body stiff? You didn't know?
I think so. Yeah.
So he just told you that that was the reason that he couldn't lift her and get her into her trunk?
Yes, ma'am.
And when he said her trunk, it was the trunk of her car he was going to put her in?
Yes, ma'am.
So what did he tell you he did when he couldn't get her body into her own trunk?
He left her there and took her car.
So what does Wilson do after that? He drives away in Melton's stolen car until he sees 43-year-old Diane Ruiz walking down the street. He pretends to need directions to a nearby school and she gets into the car. That's when he strangles her and later runs over her body with that stolen car. After this, he called up his biological father and told him he ran Ruiz over until she looked like, quote, spaghetti. He confessed to both murders during these phone calls, which were later discussed at the trial.
When he talked about these two people who were no longer with us and that he was a killer, did he show any type of remorse?
No, ma'am.
Here's where we get into Wilson's potential traumatic brain injuries, because the defense called a forensic psychiatrist to the stand.
So, did you make any a diagnosis or determinations based upon the information that you had.
Yeah, my diagnosis and belief is that Mr. Wilson has some kind of psychotic disorder. Sadly, because he was not particularly forthcoming with me, I can't characterize it very well. So I don't know exactly what Mr. Wilson has, but I think it is very significant.
The defense kept pushing this theory of brain damage, but the jury didn't buy it.
As to count 1, first-degree murder, Christine Milton. We, the jury, unanimously find that the state has established beyond a reasonable doubt that Wade Wilson was previously convicted of a felony and under sentence of imprisonment or placed on community control or on felony probation. Yes. We, the jury, find unanimously that the state has established beyond a reasonable doubt that Wade Wilson was previously convicted of another capital felony or of a felony involving the use of threat of violence to the person. Yes. We, the jury, unanimously find that the state has established beyond a reasonable doubt that the first-degree murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Yes. As to count 4, first-degree murder, Diane Ruiz. We, the jury, unanimously find that the state has established beyond a reasonable doubt that the first-degree murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Yes.
Jurors then recommended that Wilson be sentenced to death, and now it's up to Judge Nick Thompson whether that recommendation will stand or if he gets life in prison. That pretty much brings you up to speed on the case. So let's bring in today's expert guest, former Florida prosecutor Melba Pearson. So the story today, Wade Wilson, this is a very memorable trial. Looking at the defendant, his name, and then the crime itself. So if we're just starting with that, what are your feelings about Wade Wilson, the trial, and the verdict?
Yeah, so Wade Wilson definitely will go down in history as one of the more perturbing, let's say, would be a nice way to put it, defendants in our criminal justice system. Unfortunately, in the way that he presents himself, he reminds you of almost a cartoon villain, but his actions were definitely no joke. And this was not a cartoon. Sadly, this was real life. And 2 women lost their lives in a very horrible, violent manner. So I think the verdict is appropriate. I think the evidence clearly showed that the defendant was guilty of this crime. And now it's just a question of whether or not he should be put to death or if he should spend the rest of his life in prison.
So this all happened, that verdict came down back in June, and we've had a sentencing date. It was set for July, then pushed again, but now it's August 27th, and that's less than a week away. But now his defense is saying, hey, we want to do some brain scans. We think that that's appropriate. Do you think that's kind of waiting until the 11th hour? I mean, we're less than a week out from when he's set to be sentenced.
So it's not unusual for sentencing dates to be pushed out multiple times because what generally happens during that period of time between the verdict and the actual sentencing date includes what we call a pre-sentence investigation, where the personnel from the criminal justice system, whether it be through the courts or probation, it differs from state to state, but they literally do an investigation into the defendant's life, their history, how they were raised, did they have prior contacts with the criminal justice system, did they have addiction issues, were they maybe a child that was born addicted to drugs, as you think of the mom being addicted and unfortunately that was passed on to their child. Are there developmental issues that the court should be aware of, things of that nature? And also they speak to the next of kin or the victim's family to understand what they would view as justice, as well as interview the defendant himself. So all of these things happen before sentencing, and sometimes these interviews can reveal new aspects that the defense may want to bring up as mitigation during the sentencing hearing. Because again, keeping in mind, this is a death verdict, where basically the judge is deciding whether to go with the jury's recommendation of death or to do life in prison. And so, of course, the defense team is going to want to bring up as many different aspects as possible that can serve as mitigation to say, listen, he shouldn't be put to death. He should spend the rest of his life in prison. And here are some of the reasons why.
When most of us think of traumatic brain injuries, especially in relation to a convicted murderer, one specific condition and defendant come to mind.
So if they had some inkling that he may have had CTE, then that could be something they could bring up during sentencing and say, listen, what he did was heinous, but there was an explanation, which was he had brain trauma. And while he knew what he was doing was wrong, people who suffer from CTE often struggle with impulse control issues, anger issues, bursts of violence, things like that. One of the most high profile examples of that would be the Aaron Hernandez case, where he was a New England Patriots player who was convicted of murder, but it was revealed upon his death and after his brain was studied after he passed away from suicide that he had CTE from repeated hits from high school, playing ball in high school to college, all the way to the pros. So that was an explanation, not a justification, but an explanation for why he may have reacted the way he did and why the homicide occurred. The same could be said here.
Wilson's brain scans are coming just before the sentencing hearing. I mean, it's only a matter of days. But to be fair, brain damage is something Wilson's defense has been preaching from the start. And this is something his defense brought up several times throughout the trial. If you followed along, I'm sure you saw it. They actually had a forensic psychiatrist testify and talk about mental health issues he may have or conditions. What was really interesting about his testimony, though, is that Wade Wilson apparently wasn't super cooperative. So this doctor wasn't able to pinpoint exactly what he should be diagnosed with, except that it was significant.
His scores indicated that he was non-compliant, that he answered the questions, that's kind of partial compliance, but that he invalidated each test by exaggerating symptoms that most people do not have, or most people do not have to that same degree. So, in effect, he said, wow, I've got every symptom in the book. And of course, every symptom in the book is many too many symptoms. Even people who are seriously ill only have some symptoms.
Jump to now, when additional doctors are taking a look at him, they say it's possibly indicating traumatic brain injury, and that leads to the scans, what you're referring to, the CTE, potentially what it could potentially be. Now, if this is approved, he's heading to the hospital. That's where things get a little sticky too, because he's leaving the prison. How does all of that work?
Well, lots and lots of security. So generally, when you're dealing with people that are in custody and having health issues, they try to do their best to treat them or examine them in the prison setting or the jail setting, wherever they're being held. But this is a test that is much more advanced and more intricate than what the jail or prison would be able to provide. And so now he has to be transported to a hospital to do this level of testing. So obviously there would be multiple guards that would be traveling with him to the hospital. They would be stationed outside of the room to make sure that he doesn't escape or to make sure that someone doesn't come in and try and harm him in retribution for what happened to the victims. Also, they will be trying to just again assure that there's no other outside interference and basically get the results as soon as they can and transport him back. Or if it's a situation where it's emailed later on down the line, then that ends up being the case. But also another thing to note is that the date and the location of where he's being tested is being kept secret. And again, that speaks to the high level of security that needs to be maintained to ensure that there's no escape or no retribution before he is sentenced by the court, or the final sentence has been imposed by the court.
Honestly, for me, when I saw this being reported that he's going to go in for these brain scans, It got me thinking about this Grey's Anatomy episode, actually, where an inmate was taken to the hospital for whatever it may be, her condition. She needed surgery. I can't exactly remember. But she kind of prolonged her stay. She wanted to stay there longer because the hospital was more fun, so to speak, than the prison. So, is that something that the medical professionals and the guards, let's say, there will be keeping an eye on so that he can't harm himself and prolong his stay at the hospital?
Absolutely, absolutely. The hospital is not going to want to have to deal with the drama of having multiple guards and police personnel in the hallways for an extended period of time, because you have to also think about the other patients in the hospital and family members who are coming. It's very disruptive to the ordinary operations of the hospital. Not to say they're not prepared for it and they can't handle it, but they certainly don't want to prolong this longer than they have to. So, of course, he's likely going to be handcuffed while he's laying in the bed for any procedures. They're likely going to try keep any sharp objects away from him, things like that, and maybe even have him on suicide watch if that's something that's a massive concern. And of course, it is understandable that he would possibly want to stay in the hospital because, hey, the food might be just a little bit better and the environment is a little bit better. But then again, at the same token, any of us who have been to the hospital knows getting a good night's sleep in a hospital is pretty impossible as well. So can't say that one is necessarily that much better than the other. But be that as it may, I don't believe the hospital will allow him to prolong his stay in any way, shape, or form.
As Melba pointed out, when Wilson is getting these tests and even where he's getting them isn't being revealed publicly. So we're kind of in the dark there and with what comes next. So we don't know when we're going to get the results, but let's say we do have the results and it comes back and he does have traumatic brain injury or maybe even CTE. How does that change things in terms of the verdict, his sentence, all of that?
Well, the verdict remains the same because the jury heard the evidence and they made a decision and came to a verdict based on the evidence they heard. So that's not going to change anything. The question is going to be in terms of whether or not he's going to be put to death or if he's going to serve the remainder of his life in prison. And now that's going to be up to the judge to make that decision. The jury recommended death, but at the same token, the judge does have the power to override that verdict based on any, new information that may have come forth. And if the defendant is in fact diagnosed with CTE or traumatic brain injury, it's possible that the judge can say, well, that is a massive mitigating, factor in whether or not he should live or die. And so it is possible the judge could come back with a life sentence, but there's no permutation where the defendant's going to get out of prison or, get some other type of sentence. He's either going to get life or he's going to get death. Period. End of story. There's nothing in between.
I think something to highlight too is that the opposition to this death sentence, whether it gets overturned in an appeal down the line, is life in prison. And I always think back to the Parkland school shooter trial. Judge Elizabeth Schur, she was very strict about it and said, in the state of Florida, life in prison, there is no parole. It's life in prison. That is what it is.
Do you understand that in Florida, life in prison does not carry parole like other states? Do you understand that life in prison means the term of your life? It means you will not come out until you are no longer alive. Do you understand?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. At the end of the day, he's not getting out. To be blunt, the only way he's leaving prison is after he's passed away. So whether it's through the death penalty or through natural causes because he served a life sentence or some, violent event happens to him in prison, which again, sadly, that is the reality in U.S. prisons and prisons around the world. There's homicide in prison. So, that's the only way that he's leaving. And I also want to remind people that jail is not a pleasant experience. Prison is not pleasant in any way, shape, or form. I think people sometimes have the impression that somehow a death sentence is more preferable in some ways. And, again, it all depends what you believe in or whatever the case may be. But understand you are living in a very tiny room with a person that's not necessarily friendly. You don't have that freedom of autonomy to be able to move around, you get a couple hours of exercise on the sunshine outside behind bars. You're watching your family members literally abandon you in a lot of cases. You watch your partner move on with someone else. You watch your kids grow up or be raised by someone else. You may not have family members visiting you after a while. So it's not that he's going to now be in prison and he's living in a lap of luxury. It's going to be a grueling, brutal experience for him as well. So, and he'll have plenty of time to think about what he did as the world moves on without him. So either way, it is going to be a severe punishment. There's no easy way out in this scenario.
We're all waiting to see what will come out of that sentencing hearing. But even leading up to it, there's already been movement in Wilson's case. So we know that the judge denied a new trial. This is something Wade Wilson wanted, but he's not getting that new trial or the acquittal. Something he is getting, though, is this Spencer hearing on evidence. This is something I'm not super familiar with, but why it stood out to me is because it's scheduled for 9 a.m. the same day of his sentencing. So that's 9 a.m. And then at 2 p.m., he's supposed to be sentenced. Is this something that normally happens, a hearing before the sentencing hearing?
Yeah, so normally all of the things, just to be, I guess, more expeditious in terms of time, normally all of it would happen around the same time. So you wouldn't necessarily have a 9 a.m. hearing and then come back again at 2. Maybe you could have the situation where the evidentiary part happens at 9 a.m. and then the judge takes a break and then basically ponders what he thinks in this instance, male judge, so he thinks it would be the most appropriate sentence, and then comes back at 2 to render said sentence, right? So basically to say, okay, I've considered all of the facts that I heard during the course of the trial. I considered the jury's verdict. I considered the aggravators that the prosecution brought forth in their arguments during the Spencer hearing, and then I considered all of the defense arguments that they brought forth and the defense experts they brought in to talk about the mitigating factors, and my sentences X. So normally it would, kind of happen all around the same time. But clearly, because I think of the severity of what we're dealing with here and the fact that there might be extensive medical testimony that may be presented, and also if the defense has other evidence that we're not aware of at this juncture, but again, going to those mitigating factors. So maybe there's childhood trauma they want to speak about. Maybe there's some undiagnosed psychiatric condition that they want to bring experts to talk about. You did mention that during the trial, he was not cooperative with the psychiatrist at the time, and it was difficult for them to diagnose him with anything. Well, maybe he got more cooperative now that we've gotten closer to sentencing, or maybe he exhibited other behaviors that gave the observing team of experts more information to come up with a diagnosis. We don't know, but I would be very interested to see what other evidence they'd be bringing forward as mitigation. We know clearly what the aggravating factors are going to be, just the manner of death, the fact that he targeted these women, the way they suffered. This falls under the traditional definition of heinous, atrocious, and cruel, which is the standard for death penalty cases in Florida.
The state of Florida is playing a major role in this case. I mean, it's where all these crimes happened, but it's also one of only a handful of states that still have the death penalty. And that's just the reason I wanted Melba as a guest. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you specifically today is because you're a former prosecutor, so that's great, but also down in Florida, so you are pretty familiar with this type of case. What do you think is going to happen? Just based on your assumption or your hypothesis, how the judge is going to fall one way or another.
I would not be at all surprised if the judge allows the death sentence to stand and then let the defense fight it out through the appeals process. Because if a higher court comes back and says, you know what, the evidence that was presented in terms of the defendant having traumatic brain injury, CTE, or some other illness was more persuasive and he should have gotten a life sentence, well, the appeals court can send it back to the trial court and he can go ahead and impose the life sentence. End of it. End of story. I don't see a scenario where the defendant ends up with a life sentence. I don't see that. I think because of the appeals process being a way to be a check and balance on the judge, if the judge is like, well, I got it wrong, the appellate court can tell me so. If I got it right, the appellate court will confirm, and the appeals process will still take a while, regardless of this aspect. You're going to have the underlying trial itself and the usual appeals process in terms of, I don't think I got a fair trial, or certain evidence shouldn't have been admitted, or I had an objection that was overruled and it should have been sustained, or, those types of things. There's going to be an appeal regardless. So this would just be another issue in the appeals process.
Right now, there's 278 people on Florida's death row, which is the second largest in the country. And some of those inmates have been on Florida's death row since the 70s, and there's a big reason why. So you spoke about the appeals, and that really goes hand in hand with a death sentence, in my opinion. And you said there's going to be an appeal. That's something we can expect to see. So when I say that somebody has been sentenced to death, it kind of goes in the back of my mind that they probably will not be put to death for quite some time. I mean, it could be years that sometimes we see people who are sitting on death row, and then sometimes, as you said, it's overturned. So do we have a lengthy process ahead, even if the judge upholds this sentence of death?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say on average, most death penalty cases go through the appeals process for a solid 10 years. That's not abnormal. So this is not something that's going to be resolved in the next year or two. This is going to be a very lengthy process, which I know is going to be very difficult for the next of kin of the two women that were murdered, because again, every time there's a new hearing or a new petition or a brief is filed or something, the families end up getting notification, whether through the prosecutor's office or, something along those lines. They're still worried in the back of their mind, is this verdict going to stand? Is this conviction going to stand? Or are we going to have a situation where we're going to have to do this all over again? And that's pretty scary for a family to have to grapple with. So yes, this is not going to be something that's going to be rapidly resolved in any way, shape, or form.
So next Tuesday, August 27th, is a big day for Wilson. There's that Spencer evidentiary hearing in the morning, and then in the afternoon, his sentencing. We'll be there, and we'll stream the entire thing live on our YouTube page. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.